So next, I would like to introduce our speaker, Michelle Frechette. Michelle is joining us from Rochester, New York, and is head of customer success for Impress.org. She's a published author and the podcast barista at WPCoffeeTalk.com. Today, she'll be sharing with us data, anecdotes, clips, and conversation about who we are as individuals and who we are as a community. Michelle, take it away.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks for having me. I'm real excited to be kind of in Denver. I wore my bandana just in case, so I could look like I fit in with all you guys. It's probably a little different here in Rochester, but we're going to pretend that I'm there, and I'm loving every minute of it. So, talking about cups, community, and coffee talk, the lessons I've learned over 100 episodes of WP Coffee Talk, and some of the things that I want to share with you. So, how it began. Honestly, I thought to myself one day, hey, wouldn't it be cool to learn how to podcast? I mean, that'd be kind of fun. 2 years earlier, I had been to WordCamp Portland, Maine, and listened to somebody talk about how to be a podcaster. And it kind of stuck around in the back of my head a little bit as something that could be interesting to learn. I tried to sell it to customers when I was freelancing, like, hey, don't you want to start a podcast? I will help you start a podcast. And nobody wanted to start a podcast. So it had kind of just kept sticking in the back of my brain. For the course of 2018, people had asked me to be on their podcast. And so I was a guest and I was like, this is kind of cool. So maybe I want to learn how to podcast. And I thought, all right, let's see what happens. I'll get a few episodes done and it's probably going to just die a painful little death. If it does, let's hope nobody actually saw it. We'll delete it off the internet and kind of, hope it kind of goes away quietly. However, I thought to myself, like, who would even want to be on it? Like, who would want to be on a podcast with me? It's like, nobody knows me. Who's going to want to be a guest on a podcast with some woman in Rochester, New York? But the crazy thing is, they did. So I actually did what you're never supposed to do. I launched it on a Friday night because, why not? And I thought to myself, there it is. It's just sitting there on the internet. Now what? Hey, maybe I should make a Twitter channel for this, a Twitter handle. So I made Twitter. I announced it. I pushed it out on my own personal Twitter. I posted it, and I went to bed. By Monday morning, I had over 200 followers on Twitter, which was shocking to me. And 4 people had signed up to be on to have episodes with me. And I knew 2 of them. I didn't know the other 2. And so that was very exciting that even people I didn't know were, they weren't taking pity on me and asking to be on my podcast, but actually wanted to kind of meet with me and talk about how things go. So by June, which is just like, basically a couple weeks later, I was like, wow, holy cow, this thing is really taking off. And 1 year later, I celebrated 1 year of podcasting. Over 115 episodes have been recorded and 85 are published so far, with a bunch more that are kind of sitting in the can waiting to be processed and put on the internet. Every single episode starts with welcome to the next episode of WP Coffee Talk, where I get to talk to people in the WordPress community all over the world. And so far, I've spoken to people in, I think I counted, that's 18 countries so far, and 5 continents. And so if you know anybody in Antarctica, I would love to interview them on the podcast. Send them my way. And I do have some people from South America coming up on the podcast soon as well. So we're going to be able to say we've covered the whole world and talk to people in the WordPress community everywhere. And that's what's exciting to me is I get to tell everybody's stories and help them get their stories out there about what they do with WordPress. So the format is it's an interview. Its average length is about 45 minutes. I think the shortest episode has been about 25 minutes, and the longest has been about an hour and 15. But basically, it's just people having coffee, talking to each other through the internet. Anyone in the WordPress community can be a guest on WP Coffee Talk from anywhere, any company, whether they're well-known or almost unknown. I have talked to people who are just starting out. I've talked to people who are big names in the community, and it's exciting to me to be able to tell all of those stories. I call my podcast the Great Equalizer because everybody is asked the exact same set of questions. So whether you are the CEO of a very well-known company or somebody who has a blog, you get asked the same set of questions. And we're going to go through those questions so that you're going to see what some of those are. And almost anything goes on the podcast. So it's not geared towards children. And quite honestly, I think they'd be bored. Every once in a while, somebody drops a swear word. It stays in the podcast. Every once in a while, somebody says something embarrassing or drops something. It stays in the podcast because you can't edit out conversation when you normally meet with people. So that's not what we do at the podcast either. However, I do reserve the right not to publish an episode, and that has happened once or twice when it just really was poor quality. One file got corrupted, and so we had to re-record it. And another one, there were so many interruptions, phone calls, kids walking in and out, that it was just too hard to edit and to move forward. So every once in a while, it does happen. But for the most part, if you record an episode with me, you're going to be on the internet and you're going to be podcasted. So the first question I ask everybody is, tell us about yourself and what you do. So we have people who are freelancers. I've talked to a lot of freelancers all over the world, and it's exciting to hear how people approach their businesses so differently. I talk to CEOs of companies. I've talked to project managers and designers. We've talked to developers, research and development, marketers, agency owners, meetup organizers, WordCamp volunteers, coaches, automaticians, several of them, and contributors and musicians. I had somebody on the show who's a musician, and that's what their primary thing is they have a website to get their music out and to be able to raise money to continue to support themselves as a musician. So it's really exciting that anybody, as we know, the WordPress community really encompasses so many different kinds of jobs that you can do. And so whether those are people in support, whether they're developers, whether they're marketing, content managers, whatever the job is, if you are doing it in WordPress, then I want to hear about it and I want to help tell your story. The next question I said is tell us about your mug. What's in your mug today? So every guest on the podcast has to bring a mug with them. They bring their mug to the show. They put anything in it that they'd like to, and every mug tells a story, whether it's from their favorite podcast, and some of them do, whether it's from their favorite WordCamp, or somebody that a child made it for them. It has a great saying on it. There's so many different mugs, and some people even bring more than one because they can't make up their mind. It's like trying to choose a favorite child or something. So bring your mug and put something in it. And I'll tell you what, it's almost never coffee in their mug. Sometimes it's tea. A lot of times it's water or a soft drink. Sometimes it's wine. Once in a while, it's a cocktail. Several times it's been bourbon, because basically anything goes. And people say to me all the time, well, I don't drink coffee. Can I still be on your show? I said, if we met for coffee somewhere, would you grab something else to drink? Then yes, absolutely, you can be on the show. It's really just about that conversation and the idea about having conversations with people, learning who they are and how they fit into the WordPress community, as well as their thoughts about things within the community. So the next question is always, how did you get started with WordPress? And I'll tell you what, almost everybody says, I just kind of fell into it. Whether it was they had to learn it for work, they learned it in school, they decided they wanted to be a blogger, and so they looked up the best way to do blogging. A lot of people just say, I kind of fell into it, I stumbled into it, and that's kind of how I found it. Only one person in over 100 episodes said, I spent weeks researching the right CMS for my agency. Most other people kind of figured it out kind of along the way. I would say probably 90% of the people that I have interviewed say, I just kind of fell into it. I was looking for a way to build websites. I used to use Joomla, I used to use Drupal, and now I'm using WordPress. And so it's kind of interesting. Everybody kind of has a similar story that way. What is something that you think people skip or don't focus enough on when building sites that would make them better? Shouldn't surprise you that the number one answer is accessibility. Lots of us talk about accessibility. I think that when Gutenberg came out and was released, and there was accessibility talk about that, and WP Campus did a whole audit of that version of WordPress, accessibility really rose to the top. Now, accessibility we've talked about for years and years, but really, realistically, over the course of the last year and a half, we've seen a lot of people really talking about this more. So that's something that comes up an awful lot. Designing for the visitor, not the site owner. So this is always good advice as well. The site owner thinks they know what's best for their visitor, but they don't always. And so keeping that in mind and designing for your purpose, not for yourself. Design architecture, making a website that actually makes sense when you visit it so that the architecture is there and it's understandable and you have a clear call to action, which is the next thing is sometimes is the missing call to action. It could be a beautiful website, but you really don't know what to do when you get there. Security comes up often, as do the color, font, and aesthetics. And then quality content, actually having something worth visiting. It can be beautiful, it can have a call to action, but if the content isn't there, you're still lacking. So that doesn't make a good website. And so lots of people on the podcast have talked about having quality content in a designed architecture with a design for the visitor. When you put all of those things together, you can see that you can have a really, really good website. What is something you wish you had known earlier in your WordPress journey? So this is that kind of question, like if you could tell your younger self something, what would you tell them? And so lots of people have a lot of things that they wish they'd known a little bit earlier in the WordPress journey. And the number one answer is how to make and why to have backups. And I think lots of us in the WordPress space have made that mistake of not having a backup, ruining a website and having to start all over from scratch, or thankfully finding that maybe your host actually still has a backup for you, even if it's not quite as up to date as what you were working on. But that's one of the biggest things people say early on. I really wish I'd known that I should make backups and why I should do that. Also, how to make child themes so that they understand that there's ways that they can edit their site. To use staging so that they're not editing a live site and having things break right as you're working on them. A lot of people, probably half of the people that I've talked to have said they wish they'd known there was a community and that there was meetups and that there were WordCamps. Some people say, I wish I'd known there was a plugin for that. They start going deep dive into developing for something that had a simple plugin already developed. And then sometimes people say, I wish I'd known that I didn't need a plugin for something and I could style it easily myself. So there's lots of people that kind of go either direction on that one. And then people say, I wish I'd known that I'm not alone, because there is a community out there. There are other people who are along similar journeys to yours. And there are people who are out there who want to help and want to give you feedback and, be a sounding board for you and help you figure out what's going wrong so that you're not just, spinning in your own wheels like a top, but you can actually reach out to other people and get other people to help. And then more recently, I've had people say, I wish I'd known how to run a business. I didn't set out to necessarily have a WordPress business, but I have a WordPress business now, and it would have been nice to know a little bit earlier how to actually run a business instead of just be a web designer. So, it's great that you can build good sites, but if you're not good at billing and you're not good at collecting money and marketing, some of those things can fall by the wayside. So understanding actually how to run a business makes a big difference. I asked them, thinking about WordCamp or meetup experiences, what's something that was a pivotal or inspiring moment for you? And most people will say it was meeting somebody specific. Sometimes it's, they got to see somebody who they admire, they follow on Twitter all the time. They got to shake somebody's hand and realize that all of these other people that are like their WordPress celebrities are actually just real people who are also working in WordPress with them. And so having those contacts and putting those things into context is exciting. Some people say giving their first talk was actually one of those pivotal moments for them that made them realize that they weren't an imposter in the WordPress community and that they could move forward in a very positive way. Hearing a speaker tell us, whether it was something useful or inspirational, but actually pulling something out of an experience at a WordCamp is something that people talk about as well. Learning a new skill. I remember my first WordCamp, and I remember learning things and going home being like, wow, so many cool things I learned that day, and what those were able to lead to later on. So learning a new skill is also important. Finding community is something that people talk about. They walked into their first meetup and realized, again, that they weren't alone and that there were other people in this. And then, meeting Matt Mullenweg is the other one that people talk about, actually. The meeting Matt Mullenweg, I don't have that on here, but the number one thing that was inspirational was actually getting to meet Matt. So I asked people to tell us about their work. And like I said earlier, there are people in development, musicians, working in agency life, freelancers, hosting, community builders, marketing, content creation, education, and so much more. If you can think about a job in WordPress, I've probably talked to somebody doing that job, or at least doing that as part of their job. So then I ask what I call my rapid fire questions. And I always say, I will ask them rapidly, but take as much time as you'd like to answer them. And the first question I say are, what are 2 or 3 must-have plugins that you would recommend to someone building their own website? And by and large, the number one answer is Yoast or an SEO plugin in general. Some guests don't want to say name brands of any plugins. They kind of want to hedge, and that's because of their positions in the WordPress community, and that's fine. So they might say SEO in general, but most people will actually say that Yoast is important. If you want to be found, that you need to do proper SEO. WordFence, or a general security plugin, is probably the second most named, most mentioned plugin. Gravity Forms, or forms in general. A caching plugin, people find that very important as well. Something for backups, and there's probably 5 or 6 that get mentioned quite handily for that. And then probably because that's where I work, they'll tell me that Give WP for donations is important. And then my favorite comment was Marika van der Ocht from Yoast said she likes the one that makes her dashboard pink. And I said, you know what? If it makes you happy when you're working in WordPress, then yes, that is absolutely an important plugin to use. Did you have a mentor when you started with WordPress or at any point on your WordPress journey, and who was it? Most have actually said no, that they didn't actually have a mentor. So I always say too, it could be an unofficial thing, somebody that took you under their wing, somebody that you look up to or try to emulate. And many will cite somebody then that they try to emulate or look up to. And quite honestly, Nathan Ingram and Chris Lemma are the ones that have come up the most. Especially Nathan is just out there at the WordCamps sharing so much information, and Chris Lemma has so much information to share as well. So those 2 gentlemen are cited very often. But almost all say that it's a good idea and that they wish they'd had a mentor. Who is someone you admire in the WordPress community, and why? And I love this question because it gets all over the place. Many people don't want to say anybody in particular because they're afraid to kind of, let somebody down. Or I forgot to mention, it's kind of like when you're up there for the Oscars and you forget to thank your wife. So most people don't want to say anybody, but sometimes I'm still able to prod it out of them. So of course, many people will say Matt Mullenweg. Now, oftentimes they'll just say to me, Matt. And one of my biggest bloopers, if you will, as a podcaster is I actually work for a man named Matt, only it's not Matt Mullenweg, it's Matt Cromwell. So one of the people, and I said, who's somebody you admire in the WordPress community and why? They said, well, I'd have to say Matt. And I said, Matt Cromwell? And they said, him too, but I met Matt Mullenweg. So I had to save face on that one, but I admire Matt Cromwell, so there you go. But Matt Mullenweg is mentioned very much. A lot of people point to the community as a whole, that the community as a whole is what's admirable to them, and knowing that they can turn back to the community for help, as we mentioned before. The community lead team, those people who are working with the different communities. So they're working with the meetups, they're working with the WordCamps. Those people are often cited as being inspirational because they are really moving us all forward and helping us, giving us the support that we need to be able to continue to grow our communities. And many people will actually mention their boss, a supervisor, or a teacher, somebody that's been part of their life, who has been somebody who is in the WordPress community that they admire. And then again, Nathan Ingram. The man is important and he keeps coming up. And then of course, because they're looking right at me, oftentimes somebody say, well, you, Michelle. And I say, well, you have to say that because you're talking to me, but who else do you admire? I'm always flattered though, of course. What's something you want to learn in WordPress that you haven't tackled yet? And you won't be surprised to find that a lot of it is developer language. So we're talking about PHP, JavaScript. A lot of people who are in development want to learn React still. A lot of people who are using WordPress are still telling me that they want to learn how to use Gutenberg. And so I'm always giving them an encouraging word that it is not as difficult as you might think. It just takes a little bit of learning. So rip off the Band-Aid and start using the block editor. I also had people tell me that it's some things that are business related with WordPress businesses, like client management and to run their business better. And I can absolutely appreciate that, because sometimes you know everything that you really kind of want to learn with WordPress itself, but you want to learn everything that goes along with it as well. And this is my favorite question. What is one of the biggest WordPress mistakes you've made, and what did you learn from it? The white screen of death is often talked about as that biggest panic moment that you can experience as a site designer or builder. And lots of people talk about the fear that came with that white screen of death. Some people say, I can't think of anything, to which I reply, you've never made a mistake. But I understand sometimes people have to save face, but most of us have made some mistakes. Editing a live site, not using staging. Yes, of course. I think some of us have made that mistake before. Not using a child theme and editing core. Those come up a lot too. You can edit core and do a good job, but then as soon as those changes come through, those updates come through, you lose all of your edits. So understanding, again, how to use a child theme and then using that child theme. Again, not having backups, and that goes to some of the things that they wish they had learned earlier on. These kind of go hand in hand, because you wish you had backups because you made the mistake of not having a backup and not being able to redeploy that site. And then this hat tip goes to Chris Wigman of WP Engine. He killed over 20,000 sites in one single move, took up to 3 days to get them all back, and he owned every one of those. He's not owned the sites, but he owned the mistakes. And so if you want to hear him talk about that, you'll have to look up his episode. But definitely that one, I think, probably took the cake. Now, when I was at WordCamp US last fall, I actually got in line and I asked Matt Mullenweg this question and the next question, which is, what is the biggest WordPress mistake you've made? And I think he said something along the lines of trying to monetize his WordPress website early on with advertising way back in the beginning of WordPress, and realizing what a huge mistake that was at the time. So I figure if Matt Mullenweg can own up to having made some WordPress mistakes, I guess the rest of us should be able to as well. The flip side to this question is one of my favorites as well. Oh, and not understanding the business side of things. I had one more in there. But the flip side is, what is your proudest WordPress moment? And this is the part where people really have an opportunity to tell me what makes them happy with WordPress. And sometimes it isn't what I expect. I expect business owners to say, when I launched my business. But that's not what I'm hearing from people. It's things like all the way back to when they published their first site. It went live and other people could see it on the web, and how exciting that is. Getting their first plugin published in the repository. How exciting that is when they were able to actually see other people starting to download and use their plugins. Getting their first paycheck for building WordPress websites. Absolutely. Speaking at a WordCamp. Starting a WordCamp, being the first one in their community to say, hey, our city could have a WordCamp, and getting that off the ground, building community. Again, launching their business, starting a meetup. It doesn't have to be a big WordCamp. It could be, hey, let's get 5 or 6 people together once a month and start a meetup, but starting to build that community. Contributing to core, and then again, meeting Matt Mullenweg. Matt comes up a lot. And Matt's proudest moment, when I asked him that question, was his proudest moment was releasing 5.0 with Gutenberg and the block editor in it, and all the work that had gone on to create that. So I'll share that too. If you weren't working in web or web tech, what's another career you might like to attempt? And many people say teacher, musician, and a lot of WordPress. If you watch podcasts, you see the video of podcasts, you will see a lot of WordPress people have guitars hanging on the wall behind them. I don't have a guitar, but a lot of people do, or drum sets or piano. So there's a lot of musicians in the WordPress community, and some of them would actually make that their career if they weren't doing WordPress. I've had a couple people tell me they'd be a magician, a writer, stand-up comedian, food service worker, Uber driver, basketball coach, And then, I don't know, this is what I love. I can't imagine doing anything else. I asked now a couple questions that aren't necessarily WordPress related, although sometimes they actually come back to WordPress a little bit. But what is something on your bucket list? Skydiving has come up several times. Not on my bucket list, folks. I will be on the ground waiting for you to arrive with a cup of hot chocolate or something, but I am not jumping from that plane. We do have, of course, a lot of us want to travel all over the world. And it comes up a lot this year in the conversation that it's really sad that we're not able to do that right now. We're not able to go to WordCamps, that we're attending virtual events, and that travel has been curtailed a bunch. I imagine sometime next year, hopefully, that we're all going to see each other again, person to person, face to face. But traveling is something that we all want to do. Several of us want to write a novel, and Marika actually wrote a novel. I can't read it, though, because it's not in English. But someday, maybe it'll be translated, and I'll read her novel. Other people want to fly a plane. So some people want to fly it. Some people want to jump out of it. I don't want to do either one of those things. But if you do, more power to you. A lot of people just want to learn something new. Like, it's on my bucket list to learn to play the guitar or the violin or to paint or to dance. So people have all these different things that they think would be fun to learn. Some people say, I don't have a bucket list. I just do what I want to do. More power to them, man. And give a TED Talk. Now, fair warning, the Give a TED Talk was mine. I actually was interviewed on my own show for my 50th episode, and that is my bucket list item. So hold me to it. Someday I'm going to give a TED Talk. Show us or tell us about one of your hidden talents that the WordPress community might not know about. Now, if you ever watch the episodes or listen to the episodes, this is why you want to stay till the end. People have some amazing talent and some really weird stuff too in the WordPress community. People have done magic for me. People are singers. They play guitar. They do other music. Sometimes, mostly they talk about it, but every once in a while, somebody will share their talent on the show. The very first person ever on the show said that she can make grocery lists and know in her head within a couple of cents what a bottom line is going to be and how much she's going to have to pay. And that is a hidden talent. Writing. Some people say they don't have anything. One person bent over, picked up the saxophone, and played the saxophone for me right on the show. So that was really cool. He was really good too. One person danced for me, and I'm telling you, it was kind of like mosh pit dancing. It wasn't like ballroom or salsa. It was the craziest thing I'd ever seen, and it was so much fun to watch him do that. I think I laughed really hard for that one. But I will say that Ben Pines did the best Matt Mullenweg impression. He sounded just like him. If you have a chance, go to the website, listen to that episode, wait till the end, and listen to him do that Matt Mullenweg impression. I was blown away. And then I ask, how do we find you on social and online? So they give me their websites, their social handles, etc., and they're always included in the show notes on the website. So if listeners are listening and they're trying to figure out what they just say they were on Twitter, all they have to do is go back to the website and they'll find all of the details for that particular episode. So what are my takeaways from working on a podcast like this for over 100 episodes and over a year now? Well, let me tell you, if you're thinking about doing a podcast, and I encourage anybody to do it, yes, there are a ton of podcasts out there, but there's an audience for everybody. If you have something to say and you have something to share and you think you can continue it over time, if you have 5 things to say, then a podcast is probably not for you. If you have a lot to say or you have a lot of people that you can share with the community, then go for it. There's really no reason, there's nothing to stop you from doing a podcast. So these are my takeaways. Number 1, people love to talk about themselves in a good way, but that's what they do, right? We like to tell stories. We're storytellers. That's what people do. That's why we're in WordPress. That's why we do what we do, because it's all about telling stories and getting information out there. It makes my job so easy. I ask the questions, I sit back and let them tell their stories, and I just sip my coffee. It couldn't get any easier, and it's a lot of fun. Many people have never listened to the show before coming on. And I don't judge them, but if you're going to be on a podcast, my advice to you is to listen to at least 1 episode before you go on. That way you kind of know what to expect, because some of also don't read what I send them in advance, which are all the questions. So if you haven't watched the show, or listen to the show and you haven't read what I send you, you can't prepare the answers to all those questions we just went through. They're not a secret. They're on every single episode. And yet some people, I have to take some time at the beginning of the episode and walk through them just so that they know what to expect. So if you are going to be a guest on a podcast, this is just my advice, is to make sure you kind of do a little bit of research, listen to at least an episode or two before you go on. And if you are given things in advance, to just kind of, glance over them, look them over so that you are better prepared. If you are going to be a podcaster, then I suggest that you have a really, really simple but comprehensive way for people to apply to be on your show, and that you are able to automate sending them information for scheduling and also scheduling them information that you would want them to know about the show. Things like using a microphone if they have one, things like questions that you're going to ask in advance, and a way for them to get in touch with you or to reschedule if they need to. International scheduling will always be a painful process. It is not easy. Sometimes it's people trying to figure out your time instead of their time, so they sign up for the wrong time. And if an hour here or two is one thing, but when I'm talking to people in India or Australia and we're talking about a 12 or 13-hour time difference, it becomes kind of a nightmare to schedule people. So I always send reminders, and I have automated the way that people can be reminded when the show is and how it goes onto their calendar. And even then, sometimes it still gets messed up a little bit, but we try real hard. But the most important thing, I think, is to remember that people are very generous and kind, especially in the WordPress community. They're generous with their time, they're generous with their information, they're generous with their finances. This is an incredibly generous community. And when I said that my podcast would probably die a sad little death, it didn't, because of the generosity of people in wanting to contribute to what I was putting out into our community. Rendering video is very time consuming. If you don't need to do YouTube, then maybe don't do YouTube, because rendering audio is super fast, but rendering video, depending on your computer and everything, it can be anywhere from an hour for a 45-minute podcast up to 6 or 7 hours, depending on the video. So rendering video is time consuming. Prepare for disaster, but prepare more for success, because I had no idea that that would actually happen. Ask for sponsors. Content is free, right? So I'm not paying my guests, but they're not paying me. And some podcasts actually do require that you pay to be on the show. Not in WordPress necessarily, but in the community in general. But content isn't free, or content is free. So I can get people to talk on the show, but processing it is time, it's money. I invest in equipment. So ask for sponsors so that you can do the things that you need to do to be successful. And add a tip jar to your site. So I added the tip jar. I do have access to some software for fundraising. And so I'm not on Patreon, but I do have a tip jar on my website like Patreon. And if I hadn't put that on there, it wouldn't have given people an opportunity to appreciate the show and help me move forward without actually being a sponsor. And over the course of a year, I've been tipped over $200. So that, buys a new microphone, and that buys, some processing and things like that. So it's been people are very generous, and give them an opportunity to do that, to be generous with you. But the most important thing is to have fun with it. If you're not having fun with it, it isn't worth the time and the energy to do it, because you really want to enjoy what you're doing. It is time consuming. It's for every episode that I do, there's prep time, there's an hour of talking to my guest, and then there's anywhere from an hour to 5 hours of processing on the other end. If you're not committed to it, you're not going to love it, and it's going to become a chore. I love talking to the people. I love getting their stories out, and that's why for me, it continues to be something that I enjoy. If it ever becomes something I don't enjoy, we'll close the door on it and let it live in history. But for now, I'm going to keep interviewing people and keep telling the stories of people in the WordPress community. That's all I have for today. So I want to say, I don't know if we have any questions. Ron, has anybody asked any questions? Great. Awesome.
Into Q&A here.
Sure.
And I think you gained a number of new podcast subscribers in the last half hour. So this is
Yay!
pretty awesome.
Thank you.
See your count ticking up.
I'll never say no to that.
Let's see. The first question is from Diana, and she asks, were you involved with the WordPress community before you launched the podcast? And if so, in what capacity? And if not, how did you decide on the WordPress community?
Oh, very good. So let me talk about that. My history is I started working with WordPress about 11 years ago. So my best friend and I started a nonprofit agency. Her husband built us a website and we started giving him the content. And he said, oh, ladies, I'm not going to build you. I built it, but you're going to put the content in. He gave us logins, and that's how I learned WordPress was that very first website. And within a couple of years, I decided I wanted to build websites for other people, and I started a freelance agency. So I was freelancing for a number of years. I started working at Give 2.5 years ago, and last year I decided to do the podcast. And that was after having been a guest on other people's WordPress podcasts, and I saw that there was kind of a gap in this particular format and asking the same set of questions like I do. And so that's how I decided the WordPress was my community. I'm the coordinator for the Rochester meetup, and I was the founder of the the WordCamp in Rochester as well. I speak at WordCamps, and I'm on the organizing team for WordCamp US. So you might say it is my life. And so it was an easy decision. It was an easy decision to make that be what the podcast was about.
Wow, that's really cool.
Thanks.
Yeah. Let's see. The next question is from Nina. What podcast host do you use, and which would you recommend for a newbie?
So I didn't do as much research as I should have. I kind of just jumped in with both feet. And I do use something called Anchor FM. So Anchor FM is a free place to store your podcast. They will aggregate it out for you, send it out to it's on Podbean, and it's on Apple Podcasts, and it's on Google Podcasts. So it basically anywhere you can get a podcast, you can find WP Coffee Talk, and it's free, which is great. And that's really the reason I went with it up front. One of the drawbacks is I don't get analytics from all of those different places. So I only get analytics from things that are listened to specifically through Anchor, and then of course I have my YouTube analytics, but I don't know how many people listen to it through Podbean or through any of those other podcast places. So my advice is, if you want to start cheap, that's a great place to start, but you might want to look a little further than I did, because it's kind of hard to switch over halfway through like I am. So
that's a good point.
Yeah, and Joe Casabona is the podcast expert, and he's got some online courses. If you follow him on Twitter, you will get tons of really great information, and he's probably a better person to ask that question to than I am.
How do you spell his name?
So it's Joe Casabona, Casabona.
Cool, thank you.
Sure.
And this is my question. Where was the name of your podcast inspired from? Is it Saturday Night Live by any chance? Of CoffeeTalk or something else?
It wasn't, actually. I was trying to think, if I was going to have a podcast, what would I name it? And I was just I just like having coffee with friends. So we'll do Coffee Talk. And it was a couple months later that I was like, oh, that Saturday Night Live sketch. Oh, no. But it was just the idea of, there's so many WP everythings out there in the world, right? So I wanted to find something that made it more conversational. So it wasn't, an interview. It wasn't focused on, I love the Women in WordPress podcast. I listened to it. I love the Kitchen Sink podcast. I listened to it. But I wanted something that was more about just the community. And what do you do as a community? You sit down and have a cup of coffee together.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great to know. There's one follow-up question about the podcasting host, which was anything to say about Zencastr?
I haven't used it, so I don't have an opinion. But maybe I'll look it up.
Fair answer. Let's see. The next question is from Nina also. How much time do you usually spend editing each podcast episode?
So this is the way I look at that. It takes a little while to render, because I'm on YouTube as well as on podcasts. And so the video rendering takes a lot of time. So that's not editing per se, but that is just rendering the video. I have a new computer now. It does it in a seventh of the time. So it takes an hour to render a video now, as opposed to it was up to 7 hours on my old machine.
Wow.
So I'm super happy with my new MacBook Pro. But as far as editing, I look at it this way. I really don't edit. I add an intro, and I have added outros before as well. But if I was going to sit down and have a cup of coffee with you, I can't go back in time and say we didn't say that. And so I don't edit anything out. I have paused once when somebody's like, "Oh, let me go get something to show you my Her hidden talent was knitting. So I paused it while she went and got it, and I restarted it, but that's the most I've ever done as far as editing.
Cool. Let's see. Next question is from Jeffrey, and he asks, I'm just starting out with WordPress. What would you recommend for resources to start learning?
Oh, that's a great question. So I recommend absolutely WPBeginner.com. That's a great website for, there's just such rich resources. Saeed Balki has an amazing website there. Lynda.com has some great website, WordPress information. Morten Van Hendrickson does a lot of classes through lynda.com. And then there's tons of communities on Facebook too. So like you could join the WP Beginner. And just if you actually just search WordPress groups on Facebook, you'll find a lot of people there that are really willing to help you. And then meetup.com, you can search for WordPress within a certain number of miles of your home, and you'll be able to see groups of people that you can work with as well. And when you log into your WordPress website, on the dashboard, it's going to show you the upcoming meetups and WordCamps right there on the homepage of your dashboard. And so getting in touch with the people and looking for opportunities there are great. The other thing you can do is you can always tweet people. So if there's somebody in the community that you admire and you want to learn more about how they do something, you can tweet them. Some people have their DMs open on Twitter like I do. Others don't, which is fine because they would be inundated. But you can always tweet at them, and you can always reach out to people through their websites as well if there's specific people that you want to learn from. And if you, I'm always happy to be a resource as well. So if you're looking for some particular guidance, I'm always happy. You can always reach out and contact me, and I'll see what I can do to help you.
Oh, that's very generous of you. And those are great ideas. Those are excellent resources. Thanks for the long list. That was really thorough.
Oh, sure.
Okay, that was great.
No problem.
Let's see. The next question is from Diana. Did you use the questions you currently ask on your early podcasts, or did you develop these over a period of time?
The first 3 or 4, I had most of the questions, but I was lacking like maybe 3 of them. So I've added 3 questions over time. Really within the second week, where I realized I kind of had a gap in some information. I'm now over 100 episodes in. I kind of don't want to change it up too much, but sometimes I'll rephrase a question or go a little more in depth with answers and things like that. But I really have found that the questions that I use really get to the heart of who people are and what they do with WordPress in the community. And so I'm really happy to continue using those. And I'm super happy that it's been pretty consistent from the beginning.
I'm going to steal one of your own questions.
Uh-oh.
What's something you wish you had known earlier in your podcast journey?
I wish that I had done my research on where to do my hosting and understanding how to do the analytics. So I'm super grateful to my sponsors. And one of my sponsors, I do work in trade, and he is amazing with SEO. So he's helping me kind of recover some of that and be able to understand some more of my analytics going forward. But that's something that I wish that I had focused on more at the beginning, for sure.
That makes a lot of sense. And that kind of ties into the next question, which is, what advice do you have for any attendees today who may be thinking about starting their own podcast soon? Do you have 3 tips or suggestions or anything like that?
So the first thing I would say is make sure that you have a subject that you're passionate about and enough material to continue to have a podcast. It's great when you think, oh, I could talk about something for hours, but you get to the 5th episode and you're like, what now? And that's when things peter down, right? And that's when people are like, I'm bored with this now because I don't know what else to talk about. So you want to make sure that it's something that you can continue to sustain, because if you're going to get followers, you have to continue to put out new content. So make sure that that's the first number one thing. It's you're passionate about it and you have enough content to move forward. The second thing is to invest in good equipment. So, and there's all kinds of conversations on WordPress, on Twitter about WordPress, podcasts, etc. All you have to do is ask any one of us. We'll tell you what equipment we're using. We'll tell you what works well. We'll tell you what equipment we use for editing software and for recording, and everybody does something a little bit differently. But invest in good equipment for sure. And the number 3, make sure that once you get going with it, that you tell people about it. You really have to get out there and market it and kind of sing your own song or toot your own horn or whatever you want to say, because people can't know about it if you don't make them know about it. So you really have to kind of get out there and make it known.
Oh, what great advice. This is good. such good
Thanks.
content here.
Yeah, great questions.
Let's see, as you continue hosting WP Coffee Talk, what is your biggest hope for the podcast for the future?
My hope for the podcast is that other people who listen to it will learn and grow from the things that people share in the stories that they tell. And that's really I'm for me, it's not about analytics. It really isn't. I'm not trying to make $1 million off of a podcast. I made $200 in a year. I mean, let's face it, I'm not getting rich off podcasting. It's really about giving back to the community for me, and sharing people's stories and giving people an outlet to be able to do that is super important to me, because we all have something to share and we can all learn from each other. And if I can do that with a podcast and kind of bolster people up and let people kind of shine, then I think I've done a good job.
Oh, that's awesome. That's really great. I'm going to just ask one last question. It's a detailed one,
Sure.
but someone's asking, what microphone are you using today?
It's a Blue Yeti, and I'll tell you what, I didn't do any research. I had a friend. I bought a really cheap microphone off of Amazon. I don't even remember what the brand was, and I was going to use that. And I was telling him about I was starting a podcast. I wanted him to be on the show, which he never has signed up yet. But I was telling him I wanted him to be on the show, and he said, "What are you using?" And I said, "I don't. I got this thing for $70 off of Amazon." He said, "I have a Blue Yeti. I was going to do podcasting. I've got the boom mic. I've got the pop screen, everything. I'll give it to you for what you spent on the other one, and you can send the other one back." And so I got basically like $250, $300 worth of equipment for that. So it was a generous gift that he gave me. So that's why I have my Blue Yeti.
That's awesome. So Blue Yeti it is. And I think that'll be the final word for today. So Michelle, thank you so much for the wonderful talk. That was informative and inspiring, and I can't wait to actually listen to the podcast itself. So thank you so much for joining us at WordCamp Denver today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been a blast, Ron. Thank you so much for being such a great moderator and host.
Oh, well, you're very welcome.